a whisper in the fog. That's how it began. Just a voice no one saw, a name spoken only through the glass. Behind a vanished train and a blood-marked timetable lies a deception so precise, it could only be built by a man who never meant to be seen. What would you do if the most dangerous truths wore the face of the familiar? Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a bitter December morning, the sort that seemed to hang a damp veil over the city and render every lantern glow a dim, wavering orb, that I found myself once more in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire, though recently stoked, struggled against the chill that had settled in the corners like a patient enemy. Holmes stood at the window, his tall, spare figure silhouetted against the leaden light that barely pierced the fog. He was peculiarly quiet, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on the street below with a curiously abstracted air. "I observe," he said at last without turning, "that our neighbour at number 12 has a new coachman, a man of military bearing, but whose limp betrays an old cavalry wound. Likely balaclava, judging by the left side." I said nothing, knowing it best in such moods to let Holmes speak freely or not at all. He turned then, his face composed, but his eyes alight with that familiar fire of curiosity and precision. The Morning Post lay untouched, save for one newspaper folded neatly across his armchair. There, he said, was something of interest. And indeed, as he revealed it, I found myself drawn into a riddle more peculiar than most. The newspaper in question was the Daily Telegraph, and Holmes, with an air of mild amusement, directed my attention to a narrow margin on the inside of the second page. There, in a hand scarcely larger than a whisper, was a string of seemingly random words: candle, foxglove, Tuesday, regret, violets, always. "Cipher?" I asked, instinctively leaning forward. "Not quite," Holmes murmured. "It is too emotional for that. Note the order, disconnected yet carefully chosen, as if extracted from private sentiment." He tapped the page with a slender forefinger. "It is the language of clandestine affection, Watson, a communication hidden in plain sight." In no more than 5 minutes, he had constructed the background of the affair with terrifying precision. A young woman, he surmised, employed at a flower shop off Euston Road, had been receiving notes from a suitor forbidden by her father, likely owing to religious or social disparity. The words were selected from their shared code, known only to them, embedded in public print to evade suspicion. "You astonish me, Holmes," I said with honest admiration. He smiled faintly. "It is astonishing only when one has not trained the mind to hear what others overlook. There are patterns in all human behaviour, Watson, even in their deceptions." I was about to inquire further when a firm knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, her brow drawn, and announced the arrival of a most anxious gentleman from Paddington station. The man who stepped into our sitting room carried with him the unmistakable air of honest distress. He was a lean fellow, likely in his 30s, with trousers still dusted from the morning's fog and hands that could not seem to settle. His pale complexion and tightly drawn lips gave the impression of someone who had spent the better part of the day wrestling with doubt and dread. "My name is Oswald Penfield," he began, his voice wavering, despite evident attempts at composure. "I am a clerk with the Great Western Railway." Holmes, without inviting him to sit, motioned for him to continue. "There's been an incident," Penfield said, "at Paddington station, early this morning. Something I can neither explain nor forget. I didn't know whom else to turn to, sir." Holmes regarded him a moment, then gestured calmly toward the chair across from the hearth. "Then perhaps you had best begin at the beginning." Mr. Penfield's account was delivered in halting phrases, as though each detail cost him some private reserve of certainty. At precisely 7 o'clock that morning, while performing routine checks along the inbound gates of Paddington Station, he had noticed a solitary figure lingering near gate number 3. The man, dressed in an elegant overcoat and a high-brimmed top hat, stood out not by his appearance alone, but by his behaviour. "He kept pacing the platform, sir," Penfield said, "asking anyone who passed whether the train from Bristol had arrived. But there was no train scheduled from Bristol this morning. Not at that hour. I confirmed it myself." Holmes nodded once, silently urging him on. Then he stopped altogether, just stood there, eyes fixed on the rail. 10 minutes passed, perhaps more, and when next I looked, he was gone. "Gone," I repeated, "without boarding a train?" "Vanished," Penfield affirmed, "but not without trace. A timetable lay on the bench, streaked with blood. Next to it, a leather glove, and a slip of paper that read, in spidery hand, "CF saw through the glass." Holmes had not moved, yet I saw in his expression the unmistakable flicker of interest, sharp, quiet, and deadly serious. Mr. Penfield's voice trembled slightly as he resumed his account, but Holmes's attentive posture seemed to afford him a steadiness that had until now eluded him. "As I mentioned, sir," he said, clasping his hands in his lap, "the man was standing by gate number 3rd, not loitering aimlessly, mind you, but pacing. Measured steps, forward and back, like a man awaiting someone with whom he had a fixed appointment. He was well dressed, dark overcoat, collar turned up against the cold, gloves in hand, though he never wore them. And that hat, high-crowned and slightly old-fashioned, lent him a kind of distinction." Holmes nodded, but made no interruption. "The odd part," Penfield went on, "was not just his pacing. It was what he kept asking. Every 10 minutes or so, he would stop one of the station hands, or even a porter, and ask the same question. 'Has the 7:40 arrived from Bristol?' There was no such train scheduled. I told him as much myself, but he simply stared through me and repeated almost to himself, 'It's due. It must be.'" "And his accent?" Holmes asked abruptly. "You're certain it was English?" Penfield frowned in thought. "Now that you mention it, sir, he did speak with the Queen's tongue, but there was something in the rhythm, slightly off. Perhaps Irish, or colonial, I could not say." "Continue," Holmes said softly. "He turned and walked off, but less than 5 minutes later, I glanced back, and he was gone, as though the fog had swallowed him whole. I glanced at Holmes and saw that distant gleam in his eye, the look that signalled some faint crack forming in an otherwise opaque wall. There was no departing train, Penfield continued. No carriage called for him. And yet when I searched the platform and adjoining gates, he was nowhere to be seen. But that was not the end of it. He reached into his coat and retrieved a folded paper, which Holmes took with the tips of his fingers. As he unfolded it, I observed a red-brown smudge at the edge of what appeared to be a standard Great Western timetable. "This," Penfield said grimly, "was found on the bench he'd occupied. The station master brought it to me shortly after the man vanished. Blood by the look of it." "Quite so," Holmes murmured, examining it with care. There was also a glove, left on the iron armrest of the bench. Fine calfskin, the sort a gentleman might wear. No initials, no label, the left-hand glove only. Holmes said nothing, but I could see his brows knit slightly. "And this," Penfield added more quietly, producing a small torn slip of paper, "was tucked inside the timetable." Holmes read it aloud. "CF saw through the glass." He repeated the phrase twice, the second time under his breath. "Fascinating," he said at last. Watson, what do you make of it? Initials, perhaps? Or a warning? Or a confession? Holmes murmured. But of what nature we are not yet privileged to know. He handed the note back without further remark, but I could tell from his tone that the mystery had already begun to take root in his singular mind. Penfield leaned forward now, the tension in his frame unmistakable. I brought all of this, note, glove, and timetable, to the yard. Inspector Garrow took the matter. He listened, examined the objects, then asked whether the gentleman had seemed drunk. "And what was your reply?" Holmes asked, his tone sharpening faintly. I told him the man had appeared troubled, certainly, but not intoxicated, sober as any man I'd seen. Perhaps anxious, distracted, but not inebriated. Garrow nodded politely, then shrugged it off. Said it was probably a delusional vagrant with a taste for drama. Suggested I forget it. Holmes gave a dry smile. The yard's imagination remains, as ever, restricted to the visible. And you, Mr. Penfield, did you forget it? Penfield shook his head gravely. No, sir. I could not. I kept seeing that note in my mind. CF saw through the glass. It's haunted me all day, and I could not rest until I brought it to someone who might... He faltered. Who might not be so easily satisfied. Holmes finished gently. Penfield nodded. Exactly so. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. There is more, I think, that compels you beyond the note and the disappearing man. And with that quiet invitation, the heart of the matter began to emerge. The man's jaw tightened, and he lowered his gaze. When he spoke again, it was with a softness entirely unlike his earlier account. There is a personal matter, sir, one I hesitated to bring forward for fear it might colour your judgment. But after seeing that note, I can no longer believe this a coincidence. Holmes said nothing, and Penfield continued. My sister, Miss Clara Penfield, resides with our aunt in Clifton near Bristol. She is a music teacher, modest in income, but strong in spirit. 2 months ago, she met a man, a barrister named Conrad Fletcher, intelligent, courteous, well-spoken. He had recently returned from service in India and was taking up a new post in the West Country. I saw Holmes shift slightly at the name. They became engaged in the course of 6 weeks. It was sudden, but I trusted her judgment. She wrote of him often, and her letters carried a lightness I'd not seen in years. He hesitated. But 2 weeks ago, he vanished, left his lodgings without notice. His chambers say he never arrived. My sister's letters ceased. She has written twice to me, frantic, afraid, but with no news. It was this morning, upon reading that slip of paper, CF, that I felt a cold certainty. Conrad Fletcher, it must refer to him. Holmes leaned forward now, hands resting on his knees. If you are correct, Mr. Penfield, then we are not investigating a disappearance. We are unearthing something far more deliberate. For a long moment, Holmes sat utterly still, his gaze fixed on the now cooled embers of the hearth. Then slowly, he rose to his feet. The elements, he said at last, are too precise to dismiss. A man with uncertain origins, inquiring after a train that does not exist. A timetable stained with blood. A cryptic note left like a signature. And initials that match a missing man whose connection is personal, not merely public. We are no longer speculating, Watson. We are proceeding. He turned to Penfield. You have done wisely in coming here. There is no assurance yet that your fears are grounded, but the risk of inaction outweighs the comfort of doubt. Penfield let out a breath he had perhaps been holding since entering our rooms. And the glove? I asked. What might it suggest? Holmes's lips curved slightly. It suggests, my dear Watson, that someone wanted us to notice what was missing. He moved toward the bureau, retrieving his coat and gloves with characteristic briskness. Come, Watson, I suspect Paddington Station has not yet exhausted its secrets. The fog may veil many things, but not all who pass through it are invisible. And with that, the chase began in earnest. Paddington Station, as we approached it that morning, lay half-shrouded in the same heavy curtain of London fog that had followed us from Baker Street. The distant hissing of steam and the mournful cry of whistles lent a strange dissonance to the otherwise muffled air. Holmes was, as ever, alert without appearing so, his gaze sweeping from the iron arches above us to the damp stone beneath our feet. The hour was early, and few passengers yet milled about the platform. Even so, I perceived in Holmes that peculiar stillness which preceded his most focused inquiries. His eyes flicked momentarily over the signage, then to the lines of benches, iron posts, and watchful porters, whose expressions suggested that the events of the previous day had not been forgotten. "Note, Watson," he said quietly, "how the fog tends to collect against the westward gates, especially near number 3. A man seeking to vanish would not have chosen a more natural curtain." I nodded, still feeling the chill of the morning despite my greatcoat. There was something haunting in the way the mist clung to every surface, as though the very air conspired to withhold the truth. Holmes, without delay, made for the infamous gate. We came upon gate number 3, and at once Holmes's demeanour shifted into that precise, meticulous manner I had observed only in the presence of genuine intrigue. He stood at a deliberate distance, surveying the space as a painter studies his canvas before the first stroke. Then, slowly and without a word, he moved forward and knelt beside the bench where the stranger had last been seen. "This is the place," Penfield had confirmed earlier. "Right here." Holmes ran a gloved finger along the narrow iron edge of the bench. Then, rising, he turned his attention to the pane of glass set within the gate itself, a fixed viewing window, often used by passengers to scan the arriving trains. "There," he murmured, motioning me closer. "Do you observe it?" I leaned in. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but a single slender scratch ran diagonally across the lower right quadrant of the glass, too deliberate to be accidental. It had not fractured, but scored the surface as if drawn with a metal point. "Someone stood here," Holmes continued, "watching the rails beyond. The scratch is fresh, no more than a day or two old, and was made from this side." "Why scratch the glass at all?" I asked. "To mark a perspective," Holmes said, "or to direct attention. What remains to be determined is whether it was meant for another's eyes or his own." And then he turned abruptly, his gaze following some unseen thread only he could yet discern. Holmes drew in a deep breath through his nostrils, a habit I had long associated with some hidden olfactory detection. He stepped a pace back, then slowly circled the area, pausing briefly at the base of one of the gas lamps. "There is something curious here, Watson," he said. "Do you perceive it?" I approached, but could discern nothing beyond the usual damp scent of morning soot and grease. Holmes crouched again and touched the stone floor beneath the gate with a light hand. "Cologne," he said softly, "mingled with coal smoke." "Cologne?" "A faint trace, but unmistakable. Citrus, bergamot, and something sharper, possibly vetiver. A scent not typically worn by a labourer, and yet the coal residue here is heavier than elsewhere." He stood. "What does that suggest to you?" "That the man may have been in disguise," I ventured. Holmes gave a brief nod of approval. "Precisely. Either he was a gentleman attempting to appear as a working man, or vice versa. But one thing is clear. He carried 2 signals upon him, Watson, and hoped one would be ignored." The juxtaposition puzzled me, but Holmes, as ever, had already moved beyond the observation and toward its implication. From the edge of the gate, Holmes continued his silent survey of the immediate area, pausing near a line of damp stone that separated the platform from a narrow maintenance path. There, his eyes narrowed. "Observe," he said, motioning toward a series of faint but discernible marks in the grime. "A boot print, size 8, narrow heel, leads toward that rear gate." I followed his indication. The footprints, partially obscured but still visible, formed a short trail leading toward a locked iron gate that separated the main terminal from the service yard. "No passengers would have reason to be here," I remarked. "Indeed not," Holmes replied. "And yet someone passed this way, at a pace that suggests no panic, but purpose." He tested the gate, which was firmly secured with a rusted bolt. Still locked, which means either our man had access, or assistance. "Or climbed over," I suggested. Holmes gave me a brief, sidelong glance. "With mud on his boots and no sign of a scuff on the bars?" "Unlikely. No, Watson. I believe he was meant to vanish precisely at this point. The question remains, was the exit literal or symbolic?" As always, it was Holmes's manner of questioning that caused the mind to stir. Holmes sought out 3 porters who had worked the morning shift. 2 had little to offer, though one recalled vaguely a gentleman with strange eyes. It was the 3rd, a greying fellow named Mallory, who provided the most curious contribution. "Yes, sir," he said. Tall man, stood out, real polished type, but he looked like he hadn't slept. "Asked me twice about a doctor." "A doctor?" Holmes inquired, sharply now. "Aye. Came right up and asked, was the doctor aboard the train? I told him there wasn't no Bristol train scheduled at that hour. He just muttered something under his breath and wandered off." "Can you recall his voice?" Holmes asked. Mallory considered. "Strange lilt. Not English. Could have been Irish or even American. He didn't sound quite at home, if you follow me." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you see him again?" "Not after that, sir. But the odd thing was, when I went back near gate number 3 later, the platform smelled like matches and perfume." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Thank you, Mr. Mallory. You've been most helpful." And I could see from the spark in Holmes's eye that a pattern was beginning to emerge from the mist. While Holmes remained engaged in discussion with the station's supervisor, I wandered a short distance from the main platform. A rusted wire bin stood beside the wall, filled with discarded handbills and crumpled papers. With idle curiosity, I glanced within and paused. Among the debris lay a torn page from the Bath Courier, folded oddly and stained with a thumbprint. I retrieved it, smoothing the creases. It was an obituary. Mr. Conrad Fletcher, aged 41, formerly of the Colonial Bar, found deceased in lodgings near Sydney Place. Death ruled, self-inflicted. No known family. I stood staring at the name. CF. The same initials as the note, and from Bath, only a short distance from Bristol. A chill passed over me, not from the fog, but from the notion that we were no longer peering into abstraction. A man had died, and perhaps not by his own hand. I tucked the clipping into my notebook and returned to Holmes without delay. Holmes accepted the clipping with barely a glance, but as his eyes passed over the print, I saw a curious stillness settle upon him. "Conrad Fletcher," he repeated, "a name convenient in its lack of connections, a man who can die quietly and vanish without echo." "You believe the initials, CF, refer to him?" I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "Possibly, but more likely they refer not to the man, but to the fiction he represented." "You think Fletcher was not who he claimed to be? Or that he never existed at all?" Holmes murmured. "Or, more subtly still, that someone used his name for purposes he never sanctioned?" He folded the clipping and slipped it into his inner coat pocket. "We are not dealing, Watson, with a solitary man in distress. We are observing the footprints of someone who wished to be seen as a ghost, while moving with the purpose of a predator. As we stepped away from the platform, Holmes's posture grew more upright, more certain. He spoke in that low, deliberate cadence I had come to associate with the shaping of a theory. The events at gate number 3 were no accident, Watson. They were not the product of madness nor mischief. We are being led. Led, he nodded. Led through symbols and surfaces. A man appears, asks odd questions, disappears into the fog, and leaves behind a trail carefully balanced between the absurd and the alarming. To what end? That, Holmes replied, we must discover. But mark me, this is not a disappearance. It is a staged vanishing, a mirror trick for the mind. He paused, gazing once more through the scratched glass. And whoever scratched that pane, Watson, was not looking out. He was looking back. Our departure from London bore none of the usual excitement that accompanied a countryside case. Though the air was clear by the time we boarded the morning train to Bath, a chill far deeper than the weather had settled upon Holmes. He sat in rigid silence across from me, fingers laced beneath his chin. His gaze turned not to the passing scenery but inward, to a theatre of memory and conjecture where, I knew, the drama already stirred. I busied myself with my notes, occasionally casting a glance at the man opposite me. There was a severity in his features, his brow slightly furrowed, his mouth a hard, unreadable line that reminded me of certain cases long past, where the stakes, though unstated, were intensely personal to him. This was no longer a game of deductive sport. The name Conrad Fletcher had unearthed something, and the phrase "through the glass," once curious, now hovered with malevolent weight. "You are troubled," I said at length, unable to bear the silence. Holmes looked up slowly. "I am, Watson," he replied. "For the closer I look, the less certain I am that Fletcher was ever meant to be found. And yet, something of him lingers still." We arrived in Bath under a pewter sky, and after brief inquiry, made our way to Sydney Place, where Mr. Conrad Fletcher had reportedly spent his final days. His lodgings, modest but neat, were kept by a quiet woman of advancing years and sharper instincts than she let on. Holmes introduced himself with his customary civility and requested to see the deceased's room. She assented without hesitation, though her eyes lingered on Holmes with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The chamber was small, a writing desk, a single bed, and a wash basin tucked beside the window. Holmes moved through the room with deliberate care, his gaze passing over each item as if retracing Fletcher's final thoughts. He examined the ashtray, the pages in the waste bin, and the worn corners of the carpet beneath the desk. "Nothing here is staged," he murmured, "which makes the absence all the more revealing." He opened a drawer, revealing correspondence, most mundane, save for one envelope addressed to a name I did not recognize, L.R. Eastgate. Holmes took note, but said nothing, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Whatever was pursued here," he said at last, "was done under real duress." Mrs. Aldworth, the landlady, was a tall, dry-spoken woman, whose stern exterior softened perceptibly as she spoke of her former tenant. She led us to the parlour and stood by the window as Holmes seated himself. "He kept to himself," she said. "A polite gentleman, but haunted, if I may say so. In the final week, he became pale and restless. He'd go out for long walks at odd hours, always alone, and return as if from some invisible chase." "Did he ever speak of being followed?" Holmes inquired. "Not in plain terms, no. But he once remarked, almost to himself, 'They know the stations better than I do.'" Holmes made a note in his pocketbook. "Did he receive any visitors?" "None that I saw. But the night before he vanished, he received a letter, hand-delivered. I only caught a glimpse, but there was something written on the back. 'Burn after reading.' He took it upstairs, and I never saw it again." Holmes sat back, his fingers tapping once on his knee. And what did you think of him, Mrs. Aldwith? In your own estimation? She hesitated, then said quietly, I think he was trying to outrun something that knew where to wait. As we stepped back into the hallway, Holmes remained still for a moment, his eyes moving from the stairwell to the letterbox, and then finally settling on the front door's latch. He turned to me as the landlady busied herself upstairs. A man receives a letter late at night. The sender avoids the post, delivers it by hand, and inscribes a command fit for espionage. What does that tell you, Watson? That he trusted neither post nor permanence, I replied. Quite so. And note Mrs. Aldwith's wording. She never saw the letter again. It was either destroyed or taken with him. We returned to the room once more, where Holmes examined the fireplace with practiced eye. There, at the very edge of the grate, he retrieved a blackened corner of parchment, curled, brittle, and half consumed. Though unreadable, it bore a curious watermark visible beneath the soot. A crest, he muttered, obscured, but not ordinary, not civilian. You suspect government? Holmes's eyes gleamed. I suspect institution, possibly military, possibly financial, but no mere correspondent. Fletcher was afraid, and the one who wrote him knew precisely how to direct that fear. He slipped the fragment into his case and said no more. By late afternoon, we had compiled what little could be gathered from Fletcher's papers and habits. Yet one final conversation, with a bookseller 2 doors down, yielded a revelation neither Holmes nor I expected. I saw him often, the man said, gesturing towards Sydney Place. Took the train into London sometimes twice a week, always looking behind him. Not in the usual way, mind you, not absent-minded, as if expecting someone in the crowd. Did he ever mention a name? Holmes asked. Number. But he asked once if I'd ever heard of the man with the long coat and the wire hands. I thought he was reciting poetry. He wasn't. Holmes's eyes narrowed. And did he ever describe being followed? He did, not by foot. He said he saw the same man reflected in the window of 3 different carriages, never beside him, never across, only in the glass. Holmes's hand tightened slightly around the tip of his cane. There is no documented manhunt, I said quietly as we stepped away. No, Holmes replied, because the man Fletcher feared didn't follow him in public. He followed him in silence, always one pane of glass away. The journey back to London was made in brooding quiet. Holmes sat with his arms folded, not in frustration, but in the posture of a man whose mind had reached the edge of some precipice, his gaze fixed on the carriage window, though I had little doubt he saw through it to some interior reckoning beyond. Holmes, I said after some time, you haven't spoken a word since we left Sydney Place. He did not turn but said, You remember the scratch on the window at gate number 3? Of course. And the phrase on the note, CF, saw through the glass. Yes. Holmes's voice lowered, as if speaking too loudly might grant the thought undue power. Fletcher may never have known the man's name. He may never have seen his face, but he saw enough, not directly, through a reflection, perhaps once by accident, and it was that glimpse which condemned him. And the scratch? I asked. A mark of remembrance, Holmes murmured, or of warning, perhaps a message only Fletcher would understand, or a challenge. He turned from the window at last. Either way, Watson, we are no longer following a man. We are chasing a shadow. It was scarcely a day after our return from Bath that the case resumed with fresh urgency. Holmes had taken his breakfast in silence, the morning paper untouched, when a sharp rap at the door drew his attention. Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a note, her face unusually drawn. Holmes opened it without comment, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as his eyes moved swiftly across the page. Trouble returns to Paddington, Watson, he said. A constable has been found unconscious, struck down near gate number Uchunju. Another attack? I asked. More likely a diversion, he murmured. and not a clumsy one. Within the hour, we were once more at the station. The air was heavy with soot and suppressed tension. A crowd had gathered near the familiar gate, held back by a line of constables. Inspector Lestrade stood with arms folded, frowning grimly. "Same gate, different hour. I suppose this is your handiwork, Holmes," he muttered. Holmes said nothing. His eyes had already turned to the shadows beneath the iron railings, to the faint markings in the dust, to the blood on the paving stones beside the fallen constable's helmet. The ghost of Conrad Fletcher, it seemed, had returned, this time with violence in his wake. The object in question had been discovered by a porter behind the gate. An old leather suitcase, scuffed and badly worn, its handle frayed to threads. Lestrade had refrained from opening it, awaiting Holmes's arrival. With a nod from the inspector, Holmes knelt before it and, using a penknife, lifted the clasp. What emerged was a curious assortment: a false beard of theatrical quality, heavy with gum, a black overcoat, folded carefully despite its age, and a hat near identical to the one described by Penfield. Beneath these items, Holmes drew out a pair of stained gloves and a handkerchief, thick with coal dust. "A disguise," I said. "More than that," Holmes replied. "A transformation. Someone intended to become someone else, and then disappear again, just as swiftly." "But why leave the suitcase behind?" "Because the performance is finished," Holmes said softly. "Or perhaps because the actor no longer needs the costume." He rose and looked toward the rail lines. "There is no room here for coincidence. This was planted or discarded at precisely the right moment. And now we must ask, who was the audience?" Lestrade looked at him sharply. "Do you know who they meant to fool?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not yet, but I believe I know whom they meant to kill." Holmes withdrew briefly from the gathering crowd, motioning me to follow. We crossed into the shadowed length of the terminal's side corridor, where the din of commuters faded and the breath of winter seemed to creep beneath the bricks. "There are layers now, Watson," he said, his voice low. "What began as a vanishing has unfolded into a stage-managed event. A performance with its cast, its audience, and now its climax." "You believe the man who disappeared at gate number 3 was only a decoy?" I asked. "I'm certain of it. A mirror image, perhaps, or a voice sent to echo another's. We were never meant to know who he truly was, only to be confused by his presence." "And today's violence?" "A final act before the curtain rises." He withdrew a folded note from his coat. "This morning's arrival roster. Among the passengers is a retired judge, Sir Arnold Vance. He presided over a corruption case years ago that was quietly buried. I believe Fletcher had ties to it, perhaps more than ties." I stared at him. "You think he is the target?" Holmes met my gaze. "And if I am correct, then we have but minutes before that train arrives." We hastened through the corridors, Holmes moving with a swiftness that belied his usual composure. At the central terminal, he secured a list from the station master, confirming his suspicion. Sir Arnold Vance was indeed due to arrive on the 10:43 from Bristol, expected at platform 5 in a matter of minutes. I recalled the name with a jolt. The judge had been involved in a complex inquiry some years prior, a case concerning falsified government contracts and improper disbursements to foreign ventures. The scandal had faded into silence, but not, it seemed, into obscurity. "Fletcher's testimony was struck from the record," Holmes said, as we moved toward the platform. "Not by accident. Someone ensured it. And now that someone wishes to ensure silence of a different sort," I murmured. Holmes inclined his head. We passed through a series of service gates and emerged beside the arriving platform. Lestrade joined us, pistol at the ready beneath his coat. "Have your men cover both exits," Holmes instructed, "but keep them unobtrusive." The whistle sounded in the distance, and I felt that peculiar tightening of the air, the moment before the strike of a match, when the hand still hovers above the flame. The 10:43 pulled into the station, with its customary hiss and roar, trailing a veil of steam that rendered the platform a shifting theatre of white silhouettes. Holmes's eyes darted from figure to figure with mechanical precision. Sir Arnold Vance, a tall, silver-haired gentleman in judicial attire, disembarked near the front of the train, escorted by a single valet. As he turned toward the corridor, a man in a long brown coat broke suddenly from the crowd and surged forward, his hand disappearing beneath his sleeve. "Now!" Holmes cried. I saw the flash of steel before the sound of boots striking the platform overtook it. Lestrade lunged, his constables rushing in from either side, while Holmes closed the distance with astonishing speed. I was scarcely 3 steps behind when the man turned, startled not by our presence, but as if he had struck the wrong cue. The blade, thin and curved like a surgeon's instrument, fell from his hand as Lestrade tackled him to the ground. I glimpsed his face then, gaunt, pale, streaked with sweat, and wholly unfamiliar. Sir Arnold, rattled but unharmed, was escorted away. The man on the ground muttered incoherently. Then his eyes fell on Holmes. "He said I'd know him," he whispered, "but I never saw his face. Only through the glass." Holmes went utterly still. The man was bound and taken into custody, his weapons secured, his words noted. Yet it was his final utterance that lingered long after he had vanished into the custody of Scotland Yard. Holmes stood beside me in the dispersing fog, his features drawn and unreadable. "Only through the glass," I repeated softly. "He saw no face." Holmes did not reply at once. Then, with the weight of some private realization, he said, "It was never about identity, Watson. It was about the illusion of one, a reflection, a silhouette, a name spoken but never verified. And the man who sent him, he remains precisely where he wishes to be," Holmes said, "beyond reach, behind the glass." We turned then, both of us aware that this mystery, though pierced, had yet to reveal its deepest chamber. We returned to Baker Street beneath a pale and brooding sky, the chill of the morning still clinging to our coats like the final breath of something unfinished. Holmes, silent throughout the journey, shed his overcoat with a mechanical gesture and moved at once to his writing desk. I removed my gloves slowly, watching him with growing unease. There was no trace of uncertainty in his manner, only a peculiar economy of movement that spoke of a mind sharpened to its final point. He lit the fire with 3 deliberate strikes of a match, then turned to me. "Watson," he said, "we have reached the end of the 2nd act. The illusion is nearly complete. It is time now to unmask the man behind the curtain." The table before him was already covered with notes, diagrams, and a map of the Great Western Line, upon which he now began to place small black pins with quiet precision. There was no hesitation, no scribbled arithmetic or trial and error. It was, in every sense, a reconstruction of time, of space, of motive. He worked in silence, and I, watching him, could not help but feel that we had crossed a threshold, one from which no comfortable ignorance could return. Holmes spread before him a pair of railway timetables, one from London and one from Bristol, each carefully annotated in his own sharp hand. Between them, he laid a blank sheet of paper upon which he began drawing intersecting lines and time blocks, muttering fragments of speech and station names beneath his breath. "Note the frequency of express arrivals from the west," he said. 10:43, 11:50 and 2:17. Now compare that to the staffing shifts at Paddington. Do you see the pocket of inactivity? I examined the gap. From 7 to 8. Precisely. Our man chose a time when minimal oversight would allow the greatest illusion with the least resistance. He moved next to the platform diagrams and pointed to gate number 3. The position of the window, angled to reflect platform 5 behind the observer, meant that anyone looking through it might see another man's face appear, dim and distorted in the glass, and if the same man was seen at different stations, through different panes. The illusion of pursuit, I finished. He nodded. But there's more. The false train, the misplaced glove, the blood-marked timetable, each a deliberate token. He knew we would come. He laid the scene as a conjurer lays his cards. And the conjurer? I asked. Holmes looked up. He sits quietly in his clinic, hiding behind the name of a dead man. Holmes stood and walked to the window, folding his hands behind his back. The truth, Watson, is not that Fletcher vanished, but that Fletcher died long before the play began. I stared at him. You're certain? Holmes turned, his face grave. The body found in Bath bore no defensive wounds. It was not suicide. It was staged. He was murdered quietly, perhaps with an injection, by someone who knew the nervous system intimately. A surgeon, I said. A railway surgeon, Holmes replied. One with access, anonymity, and enough medical knowledge to falsify a death. Consider. Fletcher vanishes, yet his name reappears, whispered in stations, written in false notes, tied to plots he never authored. Why? Because someone needed his identity, not his testimony. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. Then the man who appeared at gate number 3 was an actor or a hired shadow, a decoy meant to stir us in the wrong direction while the real killer prepared the true stroke. And that man is? Dr. Silas Larchmere, Holmes said, surgeon of the Western Rail Line. A man known for silence, discretion, and having treated Sir Arnold for an old wound. He used his position to study his mark, and when Fletcher discovered the falsified medical records, Larchmere removed the threat. But he did not destroy the evidence. And that, Watson, is where we shall strike. Later that afternoon, Holmes reviewed the correspondence from Miss Clara Penfield. Letters once thought tender, now read with chilling clarity. He laid the most recent of them before me. Read it again, he instructed, but with the assumption that the author was not Conrad Fletcher, but someone playing him. The words, once romantic, now struck me as studied, too perfect, too lyrical, as though written by one attempting to mimic intimacy. She believed herself loved, I murmured. And why not? Holmes replied. The impostor had charm, knowledge of law, and access to Fletcher's personal history. He required only a few months to cultivate trust. Once engaged, he could justify travel, inquiry, even emotional manipulation. And all under the guise of affection, I said bitterly. Holmes's gaze sharpened. That was his masterstroke. For while Scotland Yard watched gate number 3 and the press spoke of blood-stained gloves, Larchmere stood beneath no suspicion, shielded by the sincerity of a woman's love. He tapped the letter once. Deception is most potent, not when it lies, but when it borrows truth. He needed only to inhabit a man already loved. The rest was theatre. Holmes took the note found at the station. CF saw through the glass and placed it alongside the clipping I had discovered in the wastebasket. He examined the handwriting, the ink, the angle of the tear. Watson, he said, we assumed CF referred to Conrad Fletcher. But that presumes the note was written by a third party. You believe Fletcher wrote it himself? Holmes shook his head. I believe Larchmere wrote it. To frame Fletcher? No, to impersonate him posthumously. He pointed to the curvature of the letters. This was written in a mirror. See the backward slant here? A left-handed writer attempting to replicate a right-handed script. He stepped back. CF was not the victim. He was the costume, the mask. Larchmere wrote the note, not as confession, but as misdirection. He wanted us to chase Fletcher's ghost, to tie every thread to a man already dead. So long as we did so, he remained invisible. And through the glass? Holmes's eyes were solemn. He believed no one had seen him. But mirrors lie imperfectly, Watson. Someone had, and now we shall compel him to act. That evening, Holmes composed a letter with deliberate care. He wrote not as himself, nor in the hand of any known party, but as a ghost from the past, a solicitor from Bath, referencing undiscovered correspondence belonging to the late Conrad Fletcher. The letter was addressed to Dr. Silas Larchmere and sealed in a nondescript envelope bearing the insignia of a fictitious law firm. The language was exacting, legally cautious, yet suggestive. It alluded to a packet of evidence too sensitive for open inquiry and hinted at its potential to implicate senior officials. "There is no letter," I said. "There need not be," Holmes replied. "Only the suggestion of one." He handed the envelope to Lestrade, who awaited in the hall. "Have this delivered tomorrow morning by a uniformed courier, then wait. If he does not respond within 24 hours, he is either innocent or irreparably bold. And if he does, then he shall come to the bait of his own accord." The next morning was bitter with wind. Lestrade had stationed 2 plain-clothed officers outside Larchmere's quarters, while Holmes and I returned to Baker Street to wait. The fireplace crackled, but Holmes did not stir from the window. "He will come," Holmes said. "He cannot risk uncertainty, not a man like Larchmere. Too much rests on secrecy, on control." By midday, word came. A man matching Larchmere's description had been seen entering a private coach house near Kensington, the location specified in the fabricated letter. Lestrade moved at once, concealed within the alley. Holmes and I followed not far behind, though Holmes made no haste. "We must let him believe he is safe," he said. "Only then will he reveal the full measure of his deceit." We reached the coach house at 10 minutes past the hour. The trap was set, and inside, the man behind the glass awaited the ghost he had so carefully forged. The evening light had begun to dim when Holmes summoned me to accompany him and Lestrade to a quiet lane in Kensington. We moved in near silence, our carriage rattling over the cobblestones toward a modest structure at the end of a narrow row. An old coach house, disused and long since forgotten by the city's newer rhythms. Holmes had chosen the location with care. It was removed from idle eyes, yet public enough to offer plausible deniability should things unfold improperly. Lestrade had stationed 2 plain-clothed men at the alley mouth, while we entered the coach house itself, dimly lit, empty, but for a single table and chair set at its centre. "This," Holmes said, his voice low but steady, "is the place where truth and falsehood shall finally part ways." He paced once about the room, then stood still. "He will come," he added, more to himself than to us. "Men like Larchmere fear uncertainty more than justice. The whisper of an undiscovered letter is a knife to the throat." Outside, the wind scraped against the eaves, and then, at the stroke of the hour, we heard footsteps in the gravel beyond the door. Measured, unhurried, as though the man approaching had already rehearsed his lines. The door creaked open, and into the dim light stepped a tall, spare figure clad in a charcoal grey overcoat. His face, narrow and ascetic, bore the pallor of a man too long confined to sterile rooms and solitary conclusions. There was a calm to his bearing, but beneath it, if one looked closely, was a tension not of confusion, but calculation. "Dr. Silas Larchmere," Holmes said, without moving. The man inclined his head. "I received a letter," he said. "Something about legal correspondence." Holmes gestured to the chair, and Larchmere sat with deliberate precision. The silence hung heavy until Holmes broke it. "You are a man of precision, Doctor. You favour exactitude, order, the sterilised logic of the surgical theatre. But murder, I am afraid, obeys no such laws." Larchmere did not react, save to narrow his eyes. "You assumed Fletcher would remain a whisper in the fog," Holmes continued. that no voice could rise in his defense. But you erred, fatally, not in your killing, but in your imitation. The mask you wore cracked the moment it reflected light. Larchmer's gaze darkened. Holmes stepped forward, slowly. This is your final performance, Doctor. Choose your last lie with care. Larchmer remained composed for a moment longer, his eyes darting once toward the doorway, as though measuring distance or consequence. Then, as if with a sigh that reached from the soul, he leaned back and folded his hands in his lap. "You've no letter," he said. "There is no solicitor. That was clever." Holmes offered nothing in reply. "I did not mean for it to go so far," Larchmer continued. "Fletcher was meant to frighten, not to pry. But he did pry. He found the files, certificates falsified under my name, contracts affixed with altered dates. The ministry never knew, but he did. You silenced him." Larchmer nodded once. "He would not be bought. I offered him safe passage, another name, another city. He refused." He glanced toward Lestrade. "So I did what needed doing." "And assumed his life to approach the judge," Holmes said. "For what?" I asked, unable to remain silent. "To avenge the collapse of your scheme. To stop the man who profited from it," Larchmer replied. "Sir Arnold signed the payments. I merely buried the evidence. I killed Fletcher, but I did not act alone." He smiled bitterly. "I was a surgeon to ghosts. Only now I see that one of them has outlived me." Holmes stepped forward, his voice sharpened now, like a blade honed for the final incision. "You speak of ghosts," he said, "but you fail to consider the living." Larchmer's brow furrowed slightly. "You remember gate number 3? Holmes asked. "Of course you do. You chose it for its isolation, its convenient view, and its angled glass. But what you did not anticipate was the presence of a blind newspaper vendor, Mr. Elijah Griggs, who stands by that very gate each morning, rain or shine." Larchmer's face grew still. "He cannot see," Holmes continued, "but he hears with a clarity most men never achieve. He heard your voice. He remembered it. And more importantly, he heard you speak to the constable you struck. A fragment of Latin, spoken under your breath. A surgeon's phrase. You repeated it today, unknowingly, when you entered this room. I saw it then. The falter in Larchmer's breath, the shift in his weight. You left no visual witness," Holmes concluded. "But voices carry. And Griggs, though blind, saw you more clearly than we ever could." Larchmer said nothing. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "The final stitch is drawn. Take him." Lestrade stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Larchmer's shoulder. The surgeon offered no resistance, nor protest, only a slight incline of the head, as though acknowledging not defeat, but inevitability. "I shall not speak again," he said quietly. "There is no merit in justifying ghosts." As Lestrade led him toward the door, I saw Holmes turn away, his profile half lit in the fading daylight. His expression betrayed no triumph, only a distant solemnity I had come to recognize at the end of such cases, when justice was done, but never without cost. The wind had picked up outside. The coach house groaned faintly, as if echoing the burden it had borne. Holmes said nothing as we stepped into the dusk, his eyes on the path ahead. At length I asked, "What troubles you, Holmes?" He did not turn. "Only this, Watson, that the man who crafts the perfect illusion need not wear a mask, so long as no one dares to look too closely at the face beneath." And with that, we left the coach house behind, its shadows intact, though the man who once lived within them had been brought into the fading light. That evening found us once more at Baker Street, the fire casting a flickering amber light upon the walls, while the city's winter breath pressed faintly against the window panes. The case, though resolved in action, lingered in our thoughts like the final chord of a somber melody not yet fully heard. Holmes reclined in his armchair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, while Lestrade, unusually contemplative, sat opposite with a brandy untouched at his elbow. I occupied the seat nearest the fire, pen in hand, though the words refused to come as swiftly as the memories. "We have the man," Lestrade said at last, "but I confess I cannot say I grasped the play in its entirety." Holmes did not immediately respond. He remained gazing into the flames, as though speaking not from recollection, but from some deeper, less forgiving clarity. "The play," he said at last, "was never meant for us, Lestrade. It was meant for those who do not question reflections, those who accept a name as truth, a gesture as sincerity. What we uncovered was not merely a murder, but the anatomy of deception itself." And then, with grave patience, he began to unravel the whole of it. "It began," Holmes said, "not with the man at gate number 3, but with the death of Conrad Fletcher, a man inconvenient to one with much to lose. Larchmere by then had cultivated his network, acquired his leverage, and silenced every threat but one. Fletcher's knowledge of falsified records made him a liability, but he was not simply killed. He was absorbed." Holmes stood then, crossing to the mantel where the timetable and glove still lay. He held them up briefly, as a lecturer might display the tools of his trade. By assuming Fletcher's name, Larchmere gained access to his fiancée, to legal networks, and most crucially, to the illusion of a life. He crafted the perfect ghost, one seen in passing, never quite whole, always slightly obscured. The stranger at Paddington was no real person, but a reflection Larchmere projected, an echo of Fletcher conjured to confuse. He turned to us. The entire affair was staged like a play. The gate window, the disappearing man, the trail of clues, each calculated to direct our attention precisely where Larchmere wished. Paddington Station became his theatre, and we, his audience, followed every cue. He sat again, his voice low now. It was brilliance, yes, but also profound cowardice. Holmes gestured for me to hand him the small notebook in which I had, in my own fashion, chronicled the details of the case. He opened it to the page marked by a ribbon and laid out the list we had compiled over the past week. "The timetable," he began, blood-marked and left in plain sight. What purpose does it serve but to suggest violence had already occurred? In fact, no such injury existed. It was planted. A red herring, designed to evoke urgency and mislead. He picked up the glove. Left hand only and not worn. A gentleman's glove, untouched by wear. Meant not to clothe a hand, but to point to a class. Appearances, Watson. Always appearances. The cologne mingled with coal. Two incompatible scents, one refined, the other vulgar. But used together they suggested a man who did not fit, that too, deliberate. A contradiction designed to trouble the senses and obscure identity. He paused, tapping the page lightly, and the scratch on the window, faint but deliberate. Not damage, but direction. A mark made not in haste, but with forethought, to ensure the viewer looked only where he was meant to. Each clue, re-examined, revealed its true purpose, not revelation, but obfuscation. A magician's sleight, hiding murder beneath misdirection. What then was the motive? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Holmes considered this not as a question, but as an invitation to reflection. "Not money," he said at length. "Not entirely." Larchmere had built his reputation on silence, his surgical precision not confined to the operating room, but extended to bureaucratic anatomy. He excised errors from the state for a price. He became useful to those who needed clean records and dead ends. But Fletcher? Fletcher threatened that illusion. He represented not simply danger, but disorder. And to a man like Larchmer, order is sanctity. Fletcher's moral insistence, his refusal to be bought, was not merely inconvenient. It was sacrilege. Holmes folded his hands. Larchmer did not kill in rage. He killed in calculation, because the appearance of control mattered more to him than truth. He hid not out of fear, but out of conviction that his order must remain unchallenged. "And what of Clara Penfield?" I asked. Holmes's expression did not change. She was a tool, a mirror in which he tested his disguise, and in her love he found the mask he needed to wear. I sat in silence as the last of Holmes's words drifted into the crackle of the fire. The case, for all its cleverness, had left a residue that intellect could not dissolve. Holmes stirred only slightly, his gaze distant. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the most dangerous men are not madmen, but those who wear competence as a mask. And in that quiet hour, I understood the true weight of the matter, not in the crime itself, but in the ease with which deception could be accepted, provided it wore the proper face. The case, though brought to its lawful conclusion, left behind it a silence unlike any I had known in our years together. Holmes and I sat that evening in our familiar chamber at Baker Street, the fire casting long, flickering shadows upon the walls, while the fog once more curled its spectral fingers against the window panes. I had opened my journal, meaning to commit the details while memory still held them fresh. Yet, for some time, I wrote nothing. My eyes, instead, found Holmes, motionless, solitary, a darker silhouette against the failing light. He stood by the window with hands clasped behind his back, his gaze not fixed on any point in the street below, but rather, I sensed, on something inward, something unresolved not in fact, but in philosophy. Outside, the carriages rolled by in softened rhythm, their iron wheels hissing upon the damp cobbles. Inside, only the occasional crackle of the fire broke the hush. I knew better than to intrude upon his thoughts. Whatever conclusion he had reached, it was one born of more than reason. It belonged to that deeper chamber of the mind which no deduction alone could fully illuminate. And so I wrote in silence, beneath the weight of what had passed. At length, Holmes spoke, not suddenly, but with the measured cadence of one assembling thought into speech. "Larchmer," he said, "was no villain in the sense the papers will record. He did not rage, nor gloat, nor leave chaos in his wake. He moved within order, cold, deliberate, antiseptic. He turned from the window and resumed his seat opposite the fire, folding his long hands upon one knee. Therein lies the greater danger, Watson. He wore no madness upon his brow. He passed unseen precisely because he appeared to belong. And that, I fear, is what allowed him to operate with such impunity." I nodded slowly. It was his ordinariness that shielded him. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He practiced medicine, attended charitable functions, charmed women of taste. He did all that society deems decent. And yet beneath that agreeable surface lay a mechanism entirely without conscience." He fell silent, and I saw that distant light once more in his eyes, not of triumph, but of unease. Most crimes, Watson, hide behind impulse or passion, but this was the illusion of integrity itself, the face of a gentleman masking the hand of an assassin. We spoke little after that. Some truths are not diminished by silence, they are merely absorbed. It was later, after Lestrade had departed and the room had grown dimmer still, that I ventured the question which had long troubled my thoughts. "Holmes," I said, "you never did say, what do you believe he meant by the glass?" For a moment, he did not answer. Then very quietly he replied, "The glass is perception, Watson. Not merely literal, It is the space through which we see, but never touch. It shows us a form, but not the substance. A likeness, but never the soul. I considered this in silence. Fletcher saw something. Perhaps once, perhaps more than once, Holmes continued. A shadow where a man should have stood. A familiarity betrayed by detail. A reflection that did not behave as the man behind it should. And in that instant, he knew, but it was not enough to save him. He paused, then added in a tone almost too quiet for the fire to catch. Sometimes, Watson, truth stares at us through the glass, distorted, silent, and utterly ignored. I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a second fog. There was no more to say. Some truths, I reflected, are clearest only when viewed too late. As Holmes returned to his meditations, and I to the final lines of my journal, the fog outside deepened, drawing a veil once more across Baker Street. In that hush, I found myself pondering not merely the crime we had exposed, but the quiet philosophy that underpinned it, that in a world brimming with clarity and facts, it is often the plainest truths that remain unseen, distorted by familiarity or cloaked in the comfort of assumption. And as I closed my notebook, I could not help but wonder how many more figures moved just beyond the glass, half seen, half known, yet wholly dangerous. Holmes remained at the window long after the fire had died down to embers, his silhouette etched against the London mist. At last he spoke, not to the room, but into the stillness between us. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said, "how the mind instinctively recoils from the ordinary. We look past it, overlook it, assume it harmless, when in truth, it is the most effective disguise a man can wear. Deception thrives not in shadows, but in daylight, dressed in routine." I closed my journal with care, struck, as ever, by how Holmes could distill chaos into clarity. And yet I could not help but wonder, what do you think was the criminal's greatest weapon? His knowledge, his disguise, or society's unwillingness to question what appears respectable? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes investigations and share this story with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. Until next time, the game, as ever, is afoot.